I think we had over 200 people have registered to join us this morning. So, you know, we're very honoured that so many people wanted to listen to myself, Richard, and Paul talk this morning, all things single family rental. But I think probably on that basis, time being precious and appreciating that the time that we've been given, we'll get started. So, for those of you that haven't met me or don't know me, my name is Hannah Marsh, and I'm one of the co-founders at HomeViews. HomeViews, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, is the review site for residential developments, and we cover lots of sort of living sectors on HomeViews, but have very broad coverage of build to rent and have been working within the build to rent sector for about 5 years. Earlier this year, we were acquired by Rightmove and are now part of the Rightmove family. And very excitingly, later this year, you will start to see HomeViews reviews appearing on Rightmove for build to rent, which will really sort of differentiate um, build to rent listings on Rightmove. So a big step in terms of awareness and communication of what build to rent is to consumers. But this morning we're here to talk about single family rental, and I'm really delighted that we've been joined by Richard and Paul, who are going to introduce themselves and their background and experience. But we've kind of angled this webinar really about tailoring the single family rental resident experience, and also really everything that you might be considering in your business around single family rental, with some differences and comparisons to sort of multifamily BTR, what's probably sometimes called pure build to rent in terms of that apartment living. And so please do submit your questions. We've had a few questions sent in advance, which we will endeavour to answer. But we'd love you to submit your questions during the webinar, and we will try and answer as many as possible, because we've struck this very much as a conversation. This isn't a kind of perfectly pre-practiced conversation. So it's very much to answer your questions and to have a conversation about some of the things that we're observing in the differences. So over to you, Richard, if you would do your introduction.
Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody's enjoying a slightly cooler day than it has been recently. But having said that, we shouldn't dismiss the sun too much because it's been a bit too wet. But my name is Richard Berridge. I've been in real estate for over 40 years now. It seems longer sometimes. Predominantly in residential investment, but also development in London and elsewhere, and commercial and land. I'm the founder at Blackbird Real Estate, and I've been doing that, for a little while now. We are single family rental or single family housing generalists, and that means we look at and advise on all aspects of the sector. So sort of consultancy, transactional analysis, research, and that sort of stuff. I was CEO at the UK Single Family Association, and we were recently acquired by or merged with the ARL, and I am special advisor at the ARL on all matters of single family rental, and I sit on the single family housing committee, which is broadly speaking investors, and that's chaired by David Reed of LNG. I've written a number of papers on build to rent in general, and last week was the third anniversary of a research paper that I authored, which was entitled Single Family Housing, the Home of Residential Investment. And I've previously advised and still advise other companies, LSL PLC and BNP Paribas Real Estate. And that's me.
Thank you, Richard. And Paul.
Quite the big picture of yourself to look at. So I'm Paul Borman. I'm the MD here at Ascend. We specialise in build to rent. We manage just over 7,000 single family institutionally owned assets across the UK. Prior to that, I started Dandara Living with Dandara. So that was the operational arm of the Dandara Group. And kind of built out to about 3,500 kind of operational kind of units with a decent pipeline of kind of about 7,500. And then prior to that, I was at Granger PLC. I guess that was the start of build to rent and kind of institutional ownership, kind of so involved in the kind of planning of schemes and kind of early delivery of their schemes as well. So about 10 years in kind of dedicated build to rent, and hopefully can give a rounded view of multifamily, single family, and any differences in between.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. And I think on that note, there's some fantastic work that Paul and the team at Ascend have done with some great sort of snapshots, spotlight reports alongside the ARL. And within that, I'm going to steal some of your definitions for those of you that are on the call and maybe not so familiar. So we tend to use single family housing as a term at HomeViews, and single family rental, and they're very much sort of interchangeable terms. So if we forgive us if we slip between them, because I think as a sector, everybody sort of tends to use a mixture of these. But really what we're focused on is predominantly housing, and we'll talk a little bit more. We've had some questions actually submitted in advance about how do you define single family rental as a name and as a title. But I think there's a really good definition here that you can all see on screen. There tends to be more kind of residential housing outside of city centres typically, and typically there are sort of less sort of amenities on site, but good local amenities, transport links. And I think, as the name itself says, it's sort of tended to be spoken about in relation to family, but we will come to that a little bit later on. But let's look at the big picture. You know, we're here today, Richard, to talk about the growth of single family rental. This is some data from the BPF that they released early this year, showing sort of what's complete construction and planning. You obviously look at lots of data and have lots of experience around this, but it'd be great to hear your thoughts about, you know, what's the landscape looking like? What's the picture for this part of the BTR market?
Well, it's an interesting picture. The BPF have been producing this data now for pretty much exactly 3 years. Previous to that, I wasn't saying it was all multifamily data. I think it was all sort of like lumped into one sort of data pot. So what's sort of interesting about that? So over the last 3 years of this data that's been produced, I think we started off in sort of Q1 2021 with, according to the data, about 5,139 operational single family homes. Seems a bit low to me, given how many Sigma Capital had at that time, and probably Paul, you know, was managing. And today we're looking at something like, just to get this exactly right, 12,212. The interesting thing about that is obviously it has seen some growth. It's the data has been a bit variable and it's slightly inconsistent. So what we have seen is that the data around what's currently under construction and what's in planning is very difficult to verify, because single family isn't the same as multifamily, in the sense that multifamily tends to be identified as such from pretty much from day one. Certainly these days, we've sort of gone past the days when investors were buying up large blocks of homes originally intended for sale. So they now are purpose-built for rental. That's not been really the same with single family housing, and they very rarely get identified as such early doors. It's really only the likes of partnerships with, say, Vistry partnerships and stuff like that, where you can identify quite early on what's coming through the sort of pipeline. So I would always sort of urge some caution around the data that's coming through on terms of planning and in construction, because we don't really know that much, and it can flip-flop between the two. And we've seen big house builders, and as we know, there's been quite a few deals done with big house builders in recent months, and we know that in planning terms wouldn't have been identified as single family housing, not an early time. But anyway, we are seeing sort of a growth in the sector. I think so. We've got a year-on-year growth of about from about this time last year to today for about 22% in terms of the increase in the sector. So we've certainly seen much more interest in it. Working with investors as I do at the moment, particularly if I'm doing some research, there seems to be a acknowledgement that there is a significant wall of capital waiting to deploy into the sector, and that's really quite encouraging. And a lot of the investors I talk to are really very interested in coming part of or being part of the single family rental sector. I think what we do need to see in terms of evolution, if you like, and that's the evolution of a greater number of counterparties coming into the sector being part of it. As I've sort of previously mentioned, Vistry Partners are a partnership model. We'd like to see that. I think we're seeing more people being interested in the tri-tenure model in terms of their delivery. So house builders starting to think about delivering not only social housing and housing for sale, but also a proportion of their output in terms of homes to rent to selling off to institutions. We saw recently, although it's not single family housing, we saw recently Berkeley Homes announcement that they're going to be building 4,000 multifamily units, not single family, but it's an indication of, how house builders now are considering changing their model, their delivery model, as they look at how they can smooth out that delivery process throughout every economic cycle.
I think, Richard, on that, and Paul, I know that you've done some work on this as well, but do you think that there is a different interest in investment versus single family housing versus multifamily on risk and return? Like what are the kind of the questions that you're getting asked about between the two, and where that kind of investment capital might be going?
Well, Paul and I sort of discussed this a little bit earlier, and risk and return is quite an interesting one. And risk and return is generally reflected in the yield, because the lower the yield, generally speaking, the lower the risk, and you're going to a less risky entity. And houses are, generally speaking, obviously a lot simpler to build, a lot less risky in terms of that. But having said that, and as Paul and I discussed earlier, and it's interesting to get his view because he does a lot of stuff with Gatehouse Bank, it's the counterparty risk more than the building risk itself, if you like. So as we're hoping to see sort of SMEs come into this sector, which I very much hope they do, and even smaller contractors and local contractors as well coming in, that counterparty risk is heightened because of the lack of balance sheet strength that the smaller businesses have. But certainly Paul has something to say on that.
I agree. I think obviously getting SMEs kind of building is on a lot of kind of people's agenda. I think the type of money that's investing. So, for instance, kind of we are wholly owned by Gatehouse Bank, and we form a kind of part of the Gatehouse Bank Build to Rent group with Gatehouse Investment Management. So, Gatehouse Investment Management working with global investors, let's say. If they're looking to forward commit or forward fund kind of delivery of schemes, they will probably be looking to work with kind of the tier one contractors, the national house builders in the first instance. When SMEs have kind of the track record of delivery, as Richard said, the balance sheet kind of strength as well, then kind of that would be something that perhaps they would look at. I think family offices that kind of a little bit more nimble, kind of take a view, perhaps a little bit more than global institutions, will kind of probably be the first place for SMEs to go to prove effectively that they can deliver. And then kind of they'll be able to kind of play with, I guess, the big boys in the investment world.
Absolutely. Okay, no, really interesting. And I think that probably starts to lead us on to the question, housing, single family housing, who are we building these houses for? Like, who's actually living in these buildings? And you've got data that you've put from the residents that live in across your portfolio, Paul. And this is from your Spotlight report from Manchester. Perhaps you could share a little bit of the insight that you've got around the first residents that are moving in.
So I guess the initial kind of thought was there's lots and lots of data that all operators have, and there's depends on kind of which numbers you look at. But I think the single family kind of unit number in the country is somewhere between 10 and 12,000. So when we think we are just over 7,000 managed, we think that gives effectively kind of authority to talk about market averages and kind of market responses. So we partnered with the Association for Rental Living to come up with a kind of monthly spotlight report, and we will work our way around the country, region by region, to highlight what the fundamentals are, what the rental kind of drivers are, and resident demographics. So the first report was around Greater Manchester. There's lots of buzz generally in Greater Manchester around build to rent, but also kind of with single family, that was probably the testing ground for a lot of funds and a lot of operators. We manage probably about 3,500 units in Greater Manchester. We've just released the Cheshire report. So the idea for that was to understand how does Greater Manchester play with a suburban location, an almost commuter belt for a larger city. So, and looking at the kind of regional trends and differences between the two. So from here, we can see that the average household income in Greater Manchester, across all our kind of managed homes, is just shy of 48,000. When we look at the most recent report, and that's the Cheshire region, that kind of rises to 55,000 as average household income. So what we can see from that is obviously there's a number of kind of reasons kind of why that might be the case. I think it's linked to resident profiling. So effectively, Manchester was 32 Greater Manchester, sorry, 32 is the average resident age, whereas when we look at the wider kind of Cheshire region, that's 35. So they are that kind of a little bit further in their career. So that would normally come with hopefully the kind of increase in household income as well. And then when we look at household dynamics, obviously we'll probably get into the fact that family is in both single family and multifamily, and what does it mean? I think sometimes kind of the perception is that family and single family means that it's for just families, and maybe confuses renters that are couples or people that live by themselves. But we'll go on to some more data to prove that wrong. So in Greater Manchester report, over 60%, so the majority of our kind of homes don't actually have children in. Now, we are working on an annual review, an annual survey for our residents, because I think the really interesting thing is that's a snapshot in time when they join us through the referencing process. What I think is that people are potentially moving into housing stock in suburban locations ready for maybe kind of family formation, or kind of ready for schools and what have you. But at the moment, yeah, we're seeing kind of in and around all the regions that we have, it's about 60% kind of without the families. Between kind of Cheshire and Greater Manchester, it's there or thereabouts, with kind of one child, two child kind of being about the same as well. So in terms of just kind of high level, we'll build on this month by month and kind of work our way around the country, but it gives you really interesting insight in terms of what are the differences between the regions, and then also help kind of investment decisions as well.
Yeah. And I think on that, there's also been some great work done by sort of the Data Loft Price Hub on our team, and Sandra, which I know, Paul, that you've said that you've also you're working closely with Sandra to sort of evolve this.
So again, thanks to Sandra for allowing us to kind of share the data from their Who Lives in kind of Build to Rent report. So yeah, we're always hungry to make our kind of research reports kind of even better. So yeah, we're in conversations and have agreed with kind of Sandra, Dateloft and Price Hubble to kind of use their data in our kind of monthly snapshots as well, just to make sure that we've got the kind of largest national data sets available. But widely speaking, their kind of findings are much aligned with our own. So working through from left to right, I think kind of urban multifamily build to rent, or build to rent as we've termed it earlier, is predominantly kind of couples and sharers, but less so in single family. So you're looking at green being single family about 40%, couples and sharers, whereas the majority towards 60% in urban multifamily blocks. It's rare to get kind of singles. I mean, kind of 1 in 5 of our homes, and from the research is the same, have kind of single occupancy, whereas in kind of multifamily, that's a third of renters that are kind of perhaps move into the city in an urban location, ready to start their kind of first or new job, or kind of move into a city for family and friends. And then I guess when you look at families, we've touched on it there, around about 40% in single family are kind of currently having families within them. But again, looking at the polar opposite of that in multifamily, then it's a really small segment of the multifamily kind of catchment, down at 6%. And then I think it's just that when we look at kind of the age graph, it just kind of goes to show that kind of the rental sector in this country caters for all ages, whilst kind of it's the earlier ages up to kind of your 35s and 40s that kind of predominantly kind of rent in this country. What we find from this is that multifamily have a much higher kind of proportion of your younger through to 35-year-olds kind of in their rental stock. But then kind of following that, you'll find that kind of single family outpaces kind of the percentage of renters from 35 onwards. Yeah. Which again aligns with our data. And then into kind of the final one there, you've got the income piece. So on the whole, from our data, from kind of where our price points are, I think we can deliver single family homes kind of representing a more affordable rent to renters. land values, where we choose to build, where we choose to kind of purchase portfolios. So single family on the whole can be the lower income for renters, kind of to get them one foot on the rental ladder. It will give them a great home in a suburban location, which means they don't get the tax of the urban location land values. So through to 30,000, just over 30,000, probably single family is driving kind of affordability there. Whereas multifamily then kind of kicks in really for people earning kind of over £30,000, having kind of more disposable income, and also probably needing to be in more urban locations for kind of job types and kind of access to office space.
Yeah. And I think one of the first questions we got sent, which is what I hear probably at every conference I go to, is, are we calling it the right thing? Based on the experience that you've both got, Richard, you've been researching into this for a long time. Is single family rental, is does that make sense? Is that a term that we should be using either as the industry or advertising, or what would
Well,
be sort of a better thing to be calling it?
it's a difficult question to answer because the industry, generally speaking, knows what it's talking about. In general terms, I would say that. But having same, when we were sort of running the UK SFA, people used to say how lovely it was that there was an organisation looking after single families, and single mothers and stuff like that. So it's it's one of the phrases that gets misinterpreted all the time. Again, it's one of those things that we've borrowed from the United States. The United States doesn't necessarily translate brilliantly in the UK. So in the US, they've used single family to mean houses for decades, and they've
Yeah.
always used it. It became single family rental just after the global financial crisis, when private equity companies started to buy up distressed mortgage portfolios, and that would meant basically that they weren't buying up tranches of them all sitting next to each other. They would simply be extraordinarily diverse. And so we've simply borrowed it from that, and they call it family rental on that basis. So I think that it's hard to know, so who we're aiming it at. I mean, if we're looking to the industry is probably perfectly comfortable with it. But having said that, it's constantly asking itself questions whether or not it's appropriate. I frankly don't know. I did actually do the research on this, and I used ChatGPT to come up with what I thought, what it would think would be the ideal thing, for a millennial to use to describe the sort of home that they were living in that was institutionally operated. And it came out with some really quite weird things. ProPad was one, Rent Crib was another. So it came out with a whole bunch of them, and none of them really flowed off the tongue. So, but I guess I probably, expect the millennials or Gen Zs to come up with something pretty much like they will be able to relate to. But to be honest with you, I don't know what it's going to be.
I think from my side, it's I think everyone's just really busy. So kind of when you work in a sector that already has a definition, you kind of just use it because you're too busy to think of anything different. I think frustratingly, I think Rightmove have probably coined the phrase that resonates to me kind of quite well. So when we say build to rent, that's a term to say, right, we're going to build it. What's it for? All right, it's for rent. Let's call it that. I think kind of when you look at the consumer in the market, they want to know what is it to us. So I think it ends up something like built for renters, so they know kind of it had a purpose and kind of it has all the design implications that kind of come with being built for renters. There probably needs to be a nod to institutional ownership, because that's a tick in the box for kind of longevity of kind of rental for them as well. And then I think you just get to it's houses or apartments that are built for renters, and they may be in a suburban location, they may be in a urban location, and go from there. Because I mean, although we kind of manage just over 7,000 single family units, probably 1,500 of those are blocks of apartments on single family housing sites. So then we're talking about single family housing apartments. So it gets a little bit convoluted, but I think it just means a few people in the industry that kind of carry a little bit of weight to kind of get in a room, talk about it, and don't start calling it single family until everyone else gets on board with it, would be my view.
Well, we will park it there. But yeah, it's remains one of the mysteries. I think that it's the as we see who starts to live in these homes, hopefully that will start to answer the question for us of actually how we should be labeling it. And I think just to kind of build on that, we see very consistent data from the people who are writing reviews in our subset. So the HomeViews bring out a annual build to rent report, usually around sort of April every year, where we look at the previous year. We all segment our data. This is a free industry report which anyone can download from our website. We actually called pure build to rent in this year's report what we mean by multifamily, so heavily amenitized apartment, and compared that to sort of single family housing, as well as sort of what we called rental operators, which is more the definition was around professionally managed, but buildings that weren't really intended for rent, but are then sort of less amenitized. But this is actually just showing the age demographic split of people who have written reviews on HomeViews, and we now have 92% coverage of the broader build to rent sector, 87% coverage of developments that are live in single family housing. And so you can see there from the 2023 data that just over 60% of people are sitting in that age bracket just under 34, which shows sort of broadly consistent, I think, with what the Price Hubble Data Loft report and some of your own data as well, Paul. And then actually what we do within our data and what's possible to do within our subset, so you can log into our pro dashboard and actually filter by single family housing and actually compare the resident experience at that granularity by company, by development, and see what the resident experience and ratings are. But for 4 years in a row, residents in single family housing have rated their lived experience higher than residents in for sale housing. And I think that's something that we're hoping to discuss today, is looking at the involvement and the differences from multifamily, but also single family housing is delivering a very good resident experience. It's being rated really highly on HomeViews, and much higher than someone that's chosen to sort of buy a house in a housing development. So we'll come on to and explore that a bit more as our conversation goes on. But then when we do compare single family housing, so we found renting in comparison to amenitized build to rent multifamily housing and also co-living, it is sitting just behind in scores. And I think that some of the conversations that we've had, Paul, is that there are more challenges around sort of supporting and amenitizing these kinds of a disparate portfolio than it is to when you've got everyone under one roof, under one building. So look forward to, again, exploring that a little bit further in our conversations. And then finally, just some of the data that we've got that we can share. There's a lot more data in our report and within our dashboard, but being able to actually look at some of the amenities and facilities that are being offered. And as we know, pure build to rent, multifamily build to rent, typically apartments, very highly amenitized. What you can see on this chart is actually looking at the frequency of the facilities on offer. So actually how many developments are actually kind of necessarily offering something versus actually those developments that offer it, the facility ratings that they've got. So for single family housing, if you do offer a co-working space, very few do, but if you're offering a co-working space, then those developments tend to get very high facilities ratings. What you're actually seeing more predominantly on offer is an on-site maintenance, pet-friendly parking, communal gardens, and those are sort of the most frequently offered and mentioned as well, amenities that are being offered in the single family housing space. So something that we're familiar with, but important to be able to see the difference that might impact resident experience for. So this is just some data up front. We very much wanted to have a conversation. I'm going to stop sharing and hope that we get some more questions coming through, because we really do want to answer everyone's questions today. So please do submit on the Q&A button, and we will answer as many questions as we go through. But we've talked a bit about the setup. We've talked about who are living in these buildings, what the pipeline's looking like. Let's talk a little bit about design and the involvement in design. At what stage is there a difference that you're seeing, Richard and Paul, with the involvement of developers from a single family housing point of view versus a multifamily perspective? At what stage investors and developers impact the design?
So I just sort of
My,
my
my,
view on
my view on that would be, I guess, from kind of be it my time back at kind of Granger or kind of Dandara Living, when an investor is looking to invest in kind of build to rent multifamily, they know the end game, they know kind of what it's for, they know the target demographic. So you get to the lead time being years, and you can discuss everything. You can have conversations about the room layouts, kind of moving kind of walls to create kind of different layouts and what have you, kind of the spec, where the light kind of switches sit. So you can really curate kind of every single thing in multifamily. It wasn't always like that. I mean, L&G kind of very early on, they bought some for sale schemes that kind of then pivoted onto the build to rent market, which was still great and actually a really, really good spec because it was for sale. And then kind of single family, I guess, is slightly different because currently we are still buying kind of for sale stock and kind of really kind of using kind of their floor plates and their floor plans from the national house builders and just picking the ones that most resonate with effectively kind of renters and then working with them to do kind of specs. So whether it be kitchen specs, flooring specs, white goods, EV chargers, PV panels. So you can still affect a fair amount, but it's not quite as developed and evolved as it is in the multifamily side, would be my view.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I think what we've seen in multifamily is we've seen the demise of the corridor. In terms of the apartment itself, you tend to go straight into a living space, and then straight off the living space will be two bedrooms. Generally speaking, I mean that's what I've seen sort of latterly, and that means in general terms that whilst the apartments are slightly smaller generally than a for sale apartment would be, the space is probably more usable and more appropriate for the use. You don't get any wasted corridor space. Single family is very different in the sense that it's going to be delivered in the future by a whole range of different people, and in each of those will be delivering in different locations with different vernaculars, appealing to different locations, regional and local locations. So it's very difficult to reinvent the wheel when you're talking about a house. You can divide, create sort of less corridor space as you go into the home, if you like. But then again, people do quite like a bit of a corridor space where they can put their shoes or a cupboard where they can hang their coats and stuff like that and take their shoes or that kind of stuff. It's really, for me, when we've been talking about single family, that discussion, the early discussion, has been a little bit more about how are we going to future-proof this home for us as an investor. What are we going to be looking at? Are we going to be looking at the whole life cycle values of the materials used? Because we don't really want to be replacing stuff every 5 years if we can possibly help it. We also want it to be built sustainably if we possibly can, because that's going to resonate with our investors and our committee. And also we're looking at what's our future values going to be. So are we going to have photovoltaics on the roof? Are we going to have EV car chargers? Are we going to have underfloor heating? Are we going to have air source or ground source heat pumps? Are we going to have smart homes so that we can actually monitor sort of stuff going on in the homes, and so that and we can give our residents prompts. I've spoken to businesses where they can prompt their residents to use their energy more efficiently, because they're sort of monitoring it. So at the moment, what we're seeing is, as sort of Paul says, it's sort of house builder stock, which is coming from, largely speaking, a sort of a cookie cutter basis, which they sort of put, which they can move around and put in various parts of the country. They might clad it in a different way. But generally speaking, that's what we are looking at. We haven't seen a huge amount, perhaps the scheme in Cambridge by Apache, that was purpose built. That's looking at more like townhouse designs a little bit more, sort of coming through. But I think we have to always be conscious of what the resident wants to live in, and I think residents of houses are a little more conservative than those for apartments a little way. So I think we have to respect the vernacular quite often. So I think we are going to be seeing probably less intervention in terms of design around houses, although I think probably in urban areas where you can still have houses, we might see more innovation.
Yeah.
I think just in terms of who we kind of work with already and kind of who we're consulting with currently, I think there's polar opposites on that as well. So we have some some investors that are buying standing stock, so kind of stock that kind of is for sale, but effectively perhaps hasn't kind of been sold to the market yet. So you're buying what's built, and you have zero kind of effect on that. And then kind of some of the kind of really kind of innovative kind of people that we're working with, where they have land banks, and they are kind of delivering out themselves, building themselves, and creating effectively a kind of build to rent kind of platform. So that's great, because they're now kind of almost getting as close to multifamily as you can get. So talking about, okay, in multifamily, you're talking about the amenity design, kind of how the welcome to the site looks, kind of how the site plan looks. So that's what, when people have land and have the lead-in time through kind of consultancy services with us and other operators, we talk about, okay, kind of play parks, we talk about kind of walking parks, cycling routes, all the different type of amenities that kind of are outside your home, but also then going into kind of house types and what would you change if you had the opportunity. And a lot of it is, if it's for build to rent and long-term hold, you're looking at I don't know, for sale kind of housing being carpet as soon as you walk in the front door, probably on rental. That's probably the first thing we change, Cardine or kind of similar, kind of right the way through the ground floor, just to, we know from the data it doesn't work. So yeah, I think kind of for an operator it's tricky, because we have to be able to work with investors that want to buy standing stock, and you can't affect the design, but also kind of there is really good opportunity with people that are forward thinking to create funds and to create kind of long-term holds, and that's what we're seeing coming through. So it happened in kind of, like I said earlier, multifamily, and I think it will happen in single family. As to how much you can change, as Richard said, kind of that's to come, I would imagine. And
What
then I
would
think,
you change though, Paul? Like, we probably got on the call here today, investors and developers, and I think it's interesting that we can see data on HomeViews where the same problems and same issues are identified, whether someone is an owner in a housing development or someone who's living within single family rental. It's the same age old thing. So is there really a difference for somebody who's renting from a single family rental perspective versus somebody who's bought a house? Like, what are the difference that you'd like to see that either operationally would make the difference, or from a resident's perspective?
I think it comes down to quantum as well, really, in terms of what we always used to say, what can a scheme afford? So if you have, 50 multifamily units in the centre of, Newcastle city centre, I don't think it'd be the most kind of highly amenitized and staffed kind of operation going. Which, when we look at kind of single family, and we manage about 108, I think it is, different developments at the moment of single family homes. You don't get, back in my time in Dandara, we had 995 apartments on one site in Manchester. That doesn't happen. I mean, the really fantastic stuff you can do kind of with the operational expenditure budgets and what have you when you have the quantum is fantastic. So we see, we've worked with an investor at the moment, so we've just helped them through, I think, about 150 units, but that's across 40 different locations, and the most in any one location is about 6. So kind of that isn't a play we can get into. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, I guess the land owners that want to create kind of rental product, they are perhaps looking to maybe 200-300, and then it does become an option in terms of clubhouses on site to kind of create almost that meeting place, where in multifamily you would have the lounge, or you would have kind of a bookable space. You try not to create it too much, so you could effectively allow the community to breathe and kind of create their own kind of clubs and interactions and what have you. So I think kind of it's getting to a quantum, and then effectively leaning on what we've been doing for 10 years in multifamily around creating spaces for people to collide and kind of collaborate and what have you. So whether or not that turns into every single family kind of site having tennis courts, an on-site gym, private lounge, private dining rooms, I don't think it will, just because, again, we touched on the rental there. The average income at the moment in the suburban locations is slightly lower, so that kind of will also be reflected in the asking rents. So you do need kind of the quantum to be able to build it in. But if people are kind of have the land, if people kind of have the appetite to do something, there's certainly loads that kind of can be transferred from multifamily. It's just kind of how, where, and when. Because we're not building up, we're building out in single family housing. So it's land that a house could be on, or it's land that kind of makes a garden smaller. So I think kind of that would be the amenity and the community building element. And then I think kind of what's happened in multifamily would and is already happening in single family. So when we, as part of bank build to rent group, kind of advise on kind of acquisitions, and if we're involved early enough, we have a standard kind of build to rent spec. So that would be kind of various things around handleless kitchens to avoid kind of repairs and maintenance in the future. We've already touched on kind of floor coverings just to make sure that kind of we don't get caught out there. Shower screens, as small as it sounds, kind of that bead of silicon under a shower screen on the side of a bath can cause kind of leaks and damage in the future. So really, it's just going through all the component parts based on, and again, for any operator that's got a sizable data set, we can see where the pain points are on the OpEx, and we can see, okay, well, we could save X amount of money if we engineered this problem out. So I guess it's having the foresight. Again, when I was at Grainger, we developed out kind of a standard kind of build to rent standard spec. So for any developer, they built a Grainger product, and that Grainger product was effectively time tested and kind of iterations on scheme by scheme to make sure you engineer out issues. So it's coming. We already have it kind of at Ascend, and kind of we advise even down to white goods. So I guess sometimes it's, what's the badge on the front of the kind of washing machine or the oven? Does that resonate with the potential resident in terms of quality? So that's one thing. Then you have the procurement price, but almost kind of more important is the support behind it. So what's the customer care team for Hoover Candy? What's the customer care team like at Zanussi? Because that's the thing that actually kind of really kind of helps the resident journey in build to rent. In build for sale, you buy the house and you're just stuck with a 7-day SLA if your fridge is kind of gone. But in rental, people weren't done for 7 days. So kind of we would also be advising on the customer care that comes with each of the white goods suppliers, and we've got kind of various different experiences with various different ones of those as well.
Thank you, Paul. We've had a couple of questions come in. One of the questions actually is sort of touching on the sort of the makeup of the people that live within single family rentals. So if the majority of tenants don't have children, should you bother investing in quality play areas? And if not, what alternative amenities should you be investing CapEx into?
Well, it's a great question. I think it's going back to the data is right at the point that it's taken, I guess, would be my view. So when we sit here and say, 60% don't have families, and then in the same breath talk about how you engage families, I can understand that can be a little bit confusing for people. But I guess until we get operators, and remember the snapshot at time is always during the referencing process. So whether it be kind of data loft, whether it be kind of us and the data that we present, that's a snapshot in time when they joined us. When you also look at the average tenancy length in build to rent generally, but also in single family, if we're looking at 2 to 3 years worth of kind of average tenancy, there's a hell of a lot of stuff that happens in kind of 2 or 3 years, as we all know. It flies, but there's lots of stuff that does happen. So kind of I think the next step is to understand what happens on the journey once people move into single family. Because what we could find is, well, as soon as we have a house, we can start a family. I know in my kind of perhaps old school view, it was kind of get your job, get your house, start your family, and then kind of build it out like that. And that was, in my mind, kind of buying a house. But I think obviously that it has changed, and now renting the house is the new buying, because perhaps that's too far down the road for them. So I think to answer the question, until we understand the journey of the resident post occupation, it's quite hard, and we're guessing, and that is something that we're kind of really doubling down on to try and understand what does happen once they're into a longer tenancy in single family.
Yeah, which is why I think your data is going to be, fascinating, and to be tracking that this early on into the sector is going to, it's going to really support the evolvement of amenities and facilities that get designed for the future. So brilliant. One of the other questions is also around design aspects. So build to rent projects can be helped across the line if there's a solid electrification business case, firstly. Don't know much about that personally. And secondly, if it's a net zero emissions play, or build to rent designers and developers looking at this aspect.
Well, I think they are. I think they've been looking at it for a long time. I think, but there also are issues around electrification as well, because there are restrictions around what you can build at certain times, because we don't have the capacity in grid in some areas of the country. So I know that some schemes have been paused because of that. But I do think the electrification first program is probably what I would look at if I was building a portfolio. My house actually is electric right the way through, underfloor heating and so forth. And I think it's part of a suite of elements of the house, which would include sort of air source heat pumps and underfloor heating and photovoltaics and that sort of stuff. But generally, you know, if you're looking into the future, and I think everybody should be looking to the future, and I think they should be looking to the future with a degree of clarity about what are we going to, what sort of world is it going to be, what are responsibilities, you know, for future generations. We should probably be looking at an electrical first strategy, I think, going forward, and not just, you know, a strategy about the whole place being electric, but how can that home start to generate its own energy as well and its own power? How can you conserve that energy? Can you build sort of passive house standards, which is not necessarily what everybody wants to do, but, you know, is great in terms of reducing your outgoings and your energy costs and use. So I think there's a real big piece around electrical first, particularly with the way that the transport industry is moving at the moment in terms of personal cars and electrification. So I think it's a really significant point.
Well, I think what's interesting from our side is we've been asking all residents on HomeViews for the last 4 years about sustainability, and asking them if actually sustainability is something that's important to them when they're considering their home, and then what aspects of sustainable building or amenities, facilities matter the most to them. And what we've seen every year consistently across all types of resident types is that the older the resident, the more they care about sustainability when it comes to their home, and then will they understand about sustainability in relation to their home. But what's really interesting is that looking within the build to rent sector, those that are in amenitized apartments versus those that are in houses and those that are in single family housing, it is significantly higher for those that are in single family housing, that they care more about sustainable features, care more about things like solar panels, you know, kind of the net zero greener reduction on their bills. It is actually quite a significant difference. Even within build to rent, we're seeing that growing shift happening and which ties to the slightly older demographic of single family housing within build to rent.
I think the other side of it is everyone's up for kind of saving money, right? So if kind of institutional investors can, as part of an ESG strategy, put together electric first, which means PV, means EV, it would save money on the bills, which is a byproduct of us doing the right thing, but also residents being able to kind of save kind of monthly on their utilities. I think with any kind of progression, though, there's always challenges. So kind of we look at moving from wet systems and boilers, moving to, I guess, kind of where at the moment kind of air source heat pumps and solar. But then all of a sudden the issue becomes kind of aesthetic. So everyone kind of wants the savings and kind of likes, as we touched on there, the ESG credentials. But what that then means is in your garden, effectively you've got an air source heat pump, which even the most lovely looking ones kind of aren't something you would perhaps pick. You then have the solar kind of with the battery, and on today's technology, they're not the smallest of things. And speaking to a few of my peers in the market, they become quite a nice size for the kind of the 40% of children we do have to kick footballs at the batteries. So effectively, they're quite kind of fragile things. So whether it be I know my 5-year-old would definitely do this, but putting kind of a stick or a kind of branch into the air source heat pump to see if it kind of eats it like on the TV, or if it's playing kind of Euro 2024 booting the ball against the kind of battery for the PV on the roof. I think there's challenges. So then you're building out kind of protection for those, and then all of a sudden you've got things in cages, or you've got boxes on boxes, which then creates a different kind of challenge. So yeah, I think kind of we don't have the solution yet. There's a few people we're talking to around infrared and infrared paint and what have you. There's lots of things coming. I think we're all hungry to do something different than kind of the traditional. I don't think there's one kind of bullet though that solves it. So that's something that will kind of come to fruition in the next couple of years, I think.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time and that we've got sort of 10 minutes left together, and a couple of the questions that we've had submitted both before the webinar and now actually relate more to sort of operational differences for multifamily versus single family. So I'm sort of think it's worth us sort of spending a little bit of time just talking about that. And Paul, you've alluded to some really good advice around kind of the input that you'd have on design on the actual buildings, because that would make a difference in terms of the changes. But from an operational point of view, what are some of the biggest challenges that you face? Richard, please do chime in. But I think, Paul, if you start with what you experiencing, and from your days at Dandara managing a multifamily in that comparison. We have been asked twice about management of gardens,
We'll
so
touch on gardens as well.
so I think we need to talk about gardens in this as well. Like, how do you keep gardens looking good? So
I think it's fundamental differences, obviously. So on the multifamily side, it's the staffing and the operations model that is the first thing that kind of stands out. So again, let's go back to the 995 apartments we had in Manchester at Dandara. I think we had a team of up to 23 at any one time. So that was everything in-house, everything kind of working kind of hopefully quite seamlessly, and doing quite a good job by the residents. So you can deliver a very good service. I think that particular scheme was number one, I think, development in the UK 1 year kind of with you guys. So that was great. We planned it and executed it, and people seemed to like it. Vicky, who is and was kind of the manager there, is fantastic. So it's her personal touch with the teams and what have you that curates the experience for people that live there. And the vast majority of them would have known her by name as well. Fast forward to kind of single family, where to make up 1,000 units, you're probably looking at 30, 40 different developments, which don't have kind of on-site staff because the quantum perhaps isn't there. So how would you deal with it? That's the biggest kind of element of it. I guess when I first moved over to Ascend, I likened it to kind of working at Eddie Stobart's rather than kind of property, just because it's a logistical play, and it's kind of trying to understand how you get people around the country. There's two sides to it. One is effectively dealing with people on emails, dealing with people over the phone, and what can you centralize? And then the second piece is kind of at some point you physically need to be at the property, and that could be for us Perth in Scotland down to the south coast. And how do we do that piece? So I think lots of operators have different models, from outsourcing everything to third parties, which again isn't broken. You can access kind of really good kind of local letting agents, local inventory clerks, people to take handover of your sites. So that's fine. I think kind of when you look at the customer interaction, and then going back to HomeViews, the struggle is how do you motivate other companies to motivate their staff to do what you want, and do the right thing. That's tricky. So the model that we have here is we do everything in-house. We still have problems in terms of kind of or challenges motivating people when they're 3, 4, 5 hours from the office, to do the uniform approach, standard operating procedure, and double down on service. But effectively, by having it in-house, we have territory managers, and because we're at the size of kind of units, it's a privileged position because we can have a territory manager look after from 150 units up to about 550 units is our kind of view, with a drive time on their patch of probably up to about 45 minutes to get the sweet spot there. So I guess it's a different way to recruit. So we effectively have got quite cool mapping software. So we decide where our patches are and where the territories are, and we kind of look at the optimum place to hire somebody, which can throw out some quite interesting kind of locations to hire people from. We just kind of hired the Scunthorpe territory manager last week, which covers the whole of kind of that area, but Scunthorpe is the prime position for a 45-minute kind of drive time to service up to 400 units in that patch. So I think that's the trickiest bit. Coming back to other differences, so gardens, you don't have those in build to rent, or if you do, they're on planned maintenance schedules and they're communal areas. So I think the view there is, and we consult with with different investors to do different things. Some people, when you're looking at building the brand out, building the customer offering out, our view would be not every single renter has a shed, wants a shed, has a mower, doesn't have a mower. So kind of just like in multifamily, it almost became normal to provide internet. Single family is still on that kind of journey, really. So when you think about value add and add-in services, what are they? And I would say, yeah, you're looking at kind of your internet. You're looking at memberships of potentially subsidised local gyms, not on site, but effectively kind of gyms in their own mind. But then, yeah, you get into things like, kind of, do we include the lawn mowing kind of in your rent, or is it an additional service you can opt into? At the minute, we kind of work with, you can opt into a service for some of our portfolios. some of the people that we're talking to coming through, and I think where probably the question comes from is, when it comes to relets, what does it look like? So kind of, I guess, in apartment or in house, we do kind of interim inspection, so we can make sure that the residents are looking after the property as we see fit. So that would also extend to the gardens. You can't make people kind of live tidy, and you can't make people kind of keep hold of their garden either. And some people aren't green thumbed. I mean, I'm not listing in my garden at home. So it's a service which, if you buy on scale, can be kind of really cost effective, but also kind of protects that relet. And if somebody doesn't look after a garden, and I think this is where one of the questions came from, you can end up effectively having to replace the grass or the turf, which when you look at the cost versus benefit, if you can stop that happening, kind of you can pay a lower monthly cost to a third party contractor, or something that we can do in house as well. It just guards you from kind of costs in the future, but also kind of elongating the void period, because when you're at kind of the 99% that we average occupancy across the portfolios, every single kind of minute or day or hour that kind of takes you longer to turn between tenancies, that's how you really move the dial in terms of kind of your OPEX and your cost per unit per year. I don't think we're quite at providing kind of electronic grass cutting machines for each one just yet, but that would be cool.
Yeah, I don't think robotic mowers are going to be in vogue anytime soon. I think I've seen a few of them on TikTok, maybe, and they always seem to be carrying cats around on them, and that's what seems the only thing I seem to see. I think from my perspective, in terms of operational stuff, it is all about, you know, working out how do you use this dispersed management piece. And, you know, Paul's touched on the various ways of doing that. Some operators do use third party, and I think that works perfectly well. But what this raises, in fact, when you're sort of talking about single family, so you're starting to realize, it's like an inkling of how a single family is able to touch every part of the country in some way or other. Certainly from a privilege point of view, it's going to be a privilege to bring professionally owned and operated houses to every part of the country. We can't do that with multifamily. It just does not work. The scale's wrong. So appreciating that the scale is very different, and from, as Paul says, from sort of 4 or 6 units upwards to maybe 200, depending on the scale. You know, we have the opportunity within this sector to bring what we can bring as professionally owned and managed homes to every corner of the country, and that does mean that there are going to be some significant differences in how people manage those, and whether they use third parties or not, whether they do it in-house or not, with regional managers or whatever. You know, the solutions are there to solve the issues that we have with houses. Houses are not very complicated things. You know, they're pretty straightforward stuff. They're not, you know, there's not a lot of facilities management is not quite so difficult there, and mechanical. There are no lifts, there's no Legionella and that sort of stuff going on. You know, they're pretty straightforward, and it gives people the autonomy to live in these places. So I think that, you know, from an operational management point of view, I think we're going to see a whole range of different ways in doing it, and none of them are going to be the wrong way particularly. I don't think. I think people will come through and sort of, you know, figure out which is the best way for them. They might use Viewber, for instance, for all their, you know, viewings and for their other kind of work, or even doing floor plans and stuff like that. So they might use those guys, or they might use local agents. And this is almost the interesting thing about single family housing. We can start to empower the whole of the estate agency, letting agency, land and new homes agency network right way through the country to be empowered, you know, around and just showing them what they can do, what they can be part of this. So from my perspective, single family has always been much more exciting, and the operational piece is equally exciting around who's doing what and how they're doing it. And, you know, Paul's probably one of the, I think probably, you know, Ascend are probably the preeminent single family, you know, operational manager at the moment. They have most of the data. They are working out how to do things best, and so, you know, from an operational, you know, perspective, they are probably the go-to right now.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. And I think I'd echo that. You know, we're right on the last minute here of our webinar, and the reason that we set up this webinar was to try and sort of impart some knowledge, impart some best practice, to share some insights, because it is an early stage of what single family rental looks like. As you said, Richard, the future is very exciting. Just to sort of direct anybody on the webinar to resources, Paul, as he's shown, has got his spotlight reports, which is which bring out every month, and they've also made a fantastic commitment working with Price Hubble team to continue to monitor and understand the residents that are living and the demographics that are making up their portfolio, which I think really will help to inform so much of the rest of the wider industry in terms of the needs of the future. We will continue to segment the data at HomeViews to show the differences in resident experience and what they're looking for. And we make that commitment. Richard, you have done a huge amount of thought leadership. You're now in your role as a special advisor as well for the ARL, with the huge amount of work and research that you've done in the sector. So I think it's fantastic that there's this insight that's being shared back into the sector just to continue to make it the best success that it can be. So Richard, Paul, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for everybody that's dialed in and joined us. And there was a lot more we could have covered, and maybe we'll have to do tape 2 at another time. But thank you very much.
Thanks so much.